Thanks, Rob. I'll probably drift into tariffs a bit as well, because there's some implications around that. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the situation where you take your children on holiday, you organise a really interesting outing for them, and they say, "Oh no, Dad, not another warehouse." Yeah. That tells you a lot about my life. We're all very familiar with the concept of keeping goods in bond. And generally, at the moment, what we mean by that is an excise warehouse, where excise duty is suspended, where VAT is suspended, until the point where you want to declare those goods for home use, commonly if they're going out for a retailer, whether it's off-trade or on-trade. A declaration will be made. It will probably be made on a deferment account, either your own or the warehouse keeper's, and then the excise duty and VAT will be accounted for at that point. What that implies, if you go back a step in the process, is that you have paid customs tariff, or at least accounted for zero customs tariff, and that you will have accounted for import VAT. So you will have shown it in your VAT return, and then you'll immediately have netted it off as part of the same VAT cycle. But very commonly, we're talking about excise duty suspension. Less commonly, we're talking about customs duty suspension and customs warehouses. And this was something that Ed mentioned in relation to Kingsland, where they have a customs warehouse authorisation, which currently they've made a decision not to use. The first point is that these things exist, that you can move goods around Europe, around the world in customs duty suspense, and you can choose the point at which you account for customs duty. And as we'll go on briefly, just to show, there may be some advantages about this, and it's certainly something that I would encourage businesses to think about in terms of how they manage their supply chains. There's a separate authorisation process to be a customs warehouse. There's always a separate authorisation process, but you go through it with HMRC in much the same way that you would apply to be a excise warehouse. Where I think it matters is with a thing called inward processing relief, IPR, and there's also a state called temporary storage. So if the UK is a staging post for something, then if you keep your goods in a customs suspensive regime, then you don't have to deal with any UK customs duty tariff issues. Equally, if your goods are coming through an EU member state on their way from a third country to the UK, then it may be to your advantage to put them into a customs suspensive regime within the EU. And of course, the reason that you have to think about it is that you have to apply for that status in order to get the benefit of it. There are some applications that you can make retrospectively, but I think we all know it's easier to make an application in advance than it is to have to try and make a retrospective one and pick up the bits afterwards. If you think about bulk wine coming from Australia to the EU, at the moment the EU is a single block of 28 countries, so that wine is going to have to pay CCT at some point when it crosses a customs barrier. So it really doesn't matter whether you bring the wine initially to Spain or to France or to the UK, it's going to pay the same CCT, and it pays its excise duty depending on its destination market. That's quite simple. If we go to a post-Brexit world, and particularly a post-no-deal world, if you bring wine to the UK, you will pay 0 tariff, at least for 12 months. If you bottle it here and then send it to the EU, as Rob said, you can expect to pay an EU bottled tariff. If we then put tariff back after 12 months, well, you wouldn't want to pay tariff twice, would you? So you would want to bring it into a customs suspended regime. You would want an IPR authorization for your bottling facility. You would want to make sure that that wine was processed without paying any tariff in the UK, and then when it moves to the EU, it pays tariff at that point. But if we think about that process in another direction, at least while the UK has a temporary tariff, there's a bit of an advantage in that if at the moment you bring wine into Spain and you bottle it there, you pay the tariff and you then move it anywhere you like in the European Union. Post a no-deal Brexit, if you bring wine to Spain and put it into an IPR regime, you don't pay any EU tariff because that's suspended. If you then bottle that wine in Spain and move it to the UK, at least temporarily, you don't pay any UK tariff either because it's 0. So, depending on what particular businesses are doing, their business model, what their supply chains look like, there may, in the immediate term, be some advantage in making sure that wine goes into the EU in a customs suspensive regime, either as temporary storage or goes through inward processing relief for its bottling. You're not saving very much money per bottle, certainly not on still wine, and there may be limitations on what you can do to process sparkling wine. But by the time you scale that up to a 25,000 litre flexi tank, and then multiply that by however many flexi tanks you bring in, there may be some trade-offs to be done between exactly where you choose to bring wine into the EU, how and where you choose to process it, and what reliefs you should claim. So again, this is something to be thinking about within your own organisations and to be talking to your trading partners about as this goes through.